Well, Mr. Speaker, it's an honour to represent my community of Kelowna Lake Country and speak about Bill C-18, which proposes a regime to regulate digital platforms and act as media intermediaries in Canada's new media ecosystem. In order to understand what this really means, it's like coming across a newspaper left in a coffee shop, waiting room, or staff lunchroom. Dozens or hundreds of people might read those papers throughout the day, even though only purchased one time. Should the readers be required to send money to the newspaper each time it's read? Of course not. That would be ridiculous. And yet, the outline of what I just said forms the basis on this Liberal Bill C-18. They claim C-18 will uphold the survival of small community publications and newspapers. The government and largest organizations are saying they are looking out for the little guys, but in most scenarios, it always seems to be the little guy who ends up losing. C-18 allows the news industry to collectively bargain for revenue from social media platforms that this government says are, quote, stealing journalistic content by users sharing links with friends, family, and followers. But like much of this government's supposed small business policies, it will be the most prominent companies who will benefit the greatest. The more content they put online, the more money they will make with no effort. Mr. Speaker, the notion that linking articles is the equivalent of theft has already been ruled out by the Supreme Court of Canada. As Justice Abbas wrote in Crooks versus Newton, a decision ruling that says links do not carry commercial value, quote, hyperlinks are, in essence, references which are fundamentally different from other aspects of publication. A hyperlink by itself should never be seen as publication of the content to which it refers, unquote. Conservatives believe in a robust local media ecosystem in this country. Should a Canadian newsmaker or a collective group of small publications seek to negotiate with Facebook or Google for revenue, they could do so. Smaller organizations are always more nimble. You see this whether a municipality versus the federal government or a local credit union versus a bank. The news industry is in transition with publishing methods and business models. Like its sister regulation in Bill C-11, this bill seeks to reject that kind of innovation in favor of a one-size-fits-all approach and enrich old, outdated, and predominantly large organizations currently being outrun by technological change. And just like Bill C-11, the Liberal government has called upon what they appear to view as their most agile, efficient, and modern government agency in their minds to do this, the CRTC. The government's prescription of new and continuing roles to the CRTC has stretched its mandate beyond all recognition and ability, and there are many questions on definitions in this legislation and how it will be implemented. The CRTC is an agency that took over a year to produce a 3-digit mental health number. The CRTC had no proactive oversight or risk assessing of telecoms that potentially could have mitigated the massive Rogers outage. Its 500-plus employees are already charged with the management of large portfolios, including cellular networks, data plans, advertising standards, television services, radio broadcasting, closed captioning, described video, satellite content, and now, with C-18, the entire Canadian online news and digital industries. And if C-11 is passed, they'll also be asked to measure the Canadianness of 500 hours of uploaded videos posted to YouTube alone every minute. The government originally tried to shy away from the CRTC's role in this legislation. Now we hear the Heritage Minister is openly promising to, quote, modernize CRTC so it can regulate big tech with an unexplained $8.5 million price tag. Well, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-18 will massively stretch the already massive mandate of the CRTC, of which you can argue they are already not fully fulfilling. Peter Menzies, the former CRTC Vice Chair, states, quote, it seems like they, Heritage Canada, want to have the most expansive, most intrusive, most state-involved legislation in the world in everything they do. CRTC will have a central role in the government's prescribed arbitration process, starting with selecting the pool of arbitrators and ending with the ability to impose settlements outright. The large digital platform negotiations with every Canadian media outlet needs to be completed within 6 months, or then forced into arbitration. Can the government credibly claim that such an arbitration process would favour small regional publications over giants like Torstar, Postmedia, Bell, Rogers, or the CBC? No, it can't, which is why, in a technical briefing with reporters, the Minister of Canadian Heritage's staff acknowledged that the largest beneficiary of this legislation would be the CBC, a news organization the government publicly funds. Here's how. In this legislation, news outlets would be paid based on content shared or streamed. All the state-owned CBC has to do is live stream 24 hours a day on the likes of Facebook or other platforms, and they'll be raking in the cash. Small producers don't necessarily have the content or capacity to do this. This, in fact, would rank up these large organizations even higher due to the amount of content they would put on social media, and it would be funded by the structure of this legislation. The CBC's advertising revenue is low compared to their massive budget, so this is an easy way to bring in the cash with literally no effort. Mr. Speaker, we've heard from this government Australia cited as the model to follow. However, our research shows complaints have been made by small media publications in Australia about its news media bargaining laws, the same laws the Canadian government is seeking to copy here. In a submission to the Australian Senate Economics Committee, the Country Press Australia Association, a bargaining group of small regional publications, precisely the kind of group the large media organizations and government says would likely emerge to represent smaller publications in Canada, said of Australia's own Bill C-18, quote, "The bill is weighted to large media organizations and does not take into account the ongoing need for a diversified media across Australia. It could in fact lead to an outcome that is opposite to the intention of this bill, that is, a reduction in media diversity." I'm very concerned with the unintended consequences being created by this bill, especially with the largest of organizations and the Canadian state-owned media being the biggest benefactors. Sports media companies like The Athletic have found innovative ways to uphold local sports coverage under the umbrella of an international publication. Copying Australia's homework won't help us very much if it's already gotten a failing grade. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd testified Australia's legislation would be, quote, "enhancing the power of the existing monopoly," unquote. Joshua Benton, the founder of Harvard University's Nieman Journalism Lab, called it, quote, "bad media policy," unquote. The inventor of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, said laws like Australia's could, quote, "make the internet as we know it unworkable." And Vint Cerf, another founding father of the internet, once attributed its astounding economic success to two words: permissionless innovation. Regulations like Bill C-18 is a permission, and it is the swiftest killer of innovation and the greatest tool of existing media powers to kill competition. Forget internet searching as we know it. Calling upon the threadbare CRTC to enforce a dysfunctional Australian-like media policy will do nothing to help the small media markets in places like my community of Kelowna Lake Country. It will make permanent the actions of this government to bail out legacy media giants from their own business model mistakes and lack of nimbleness. Well, Mr. Speaker, if the government was so interested in ensuring that small, regional, and rural media have their share of ad revenue, stop pumping millions into the mainstream media, giving them the ability to reduce advertising rates. Remove $1.3 billion a year from the state-owned media. And if they're so valued by the Canadian public, they should be able to attract advertisers and fundraise like other public broadcast organizations do around the world. The biggest winners in this legislation are the biggest media outlets, which is why you see them advocating so strongly for this. And in my life experience, anytime you hear the largest of organizations say they're looking out for the little guys and have their best interest, it's always the little guy who ends up losing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Rimouski-Neigette.
The honourable member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-Lébasque. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to commend my colleague and congratulate her for her speech in Bill C-18, which was tabled by the Minister for Canadian Heritage. It defines what big platforms will have to negotiate with local media and regional media in order to obtain their just part. Web giants take information and content from regional and local media and use it on their own platforms without paying any royalties at the moment. So this bill, the Bloc Québécois is for this bill, and we expected this to be done in the past, but it's never too late to do so now. My question is as follows. We note that digital companies that will be targeted by this bill are big, dominant platforms here in Canada. So Facebook and Google, just to name two. But there are other platforms that benefit from local media content. Why should C-18 be restricted just to Facebook and Google and not others? Perhaps this scope could be broadened in C-18. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member for his question. You know, this is exactly the premise of this. In fact, is that it will perpetuate even the greater success of the large media companies. In order for the small media organizations, the small independent media organizations and communities across this country to even be at the table, they will have to form some type of a collective in order to negotiate some type of arrangement moving forward, and so therein lies the issue. And in fact, you know, as I mentioned, a lot of the bigger players, the way that this is perpetuating will actually help them considerably more than it will the small independent media organizations.
In comments, question commentaire, the honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Speaker, well, I'm certainly not going to suggest that the CRTC is the best avenue to deal with the digital giants. But when I listen to my honourable colleague, and she talks about these big media companies, the big media companies, she's missing out the fundamental fact that the biggest media company in the world is Facebook. $82.4 billion in ad revenue. And the other fact of this ad revenue is that Facebook falsified its metrics, which anywhere else would be fraud. But when you've got monopolistic control, people had no choice. So Facebook is actually deciding what people see through the algorithms. So you can get a extreme right-wing marginal publication like Breitbart be one of the highest read on Facebook because of the algorithms. They are the editor. They are deciding what's being seen. They have falsified their metrics. Their profits are unprecedented. I don't see why it is that the Conservative Party is bending themselves backwards to defend a company like Facebook that has shown such dismal commitments to human rights, dismal commitments to democracy, and dismal commitments to working for innovation other than making Mark Zuckerberg one of the richest people on the planet.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable colleague for his question. Well, you know, what we're talking about here has to do with online media, and this has to do especially with small, independent media in communities all across this country. That's what this legislation is a lot about. And also it's about giving the CRTC sweeping powers. And I was happy to hear the member say that he wasn't a huge fan of maybe how the CRTC operates. And that was a big part of my speech is, you know, we're now giving an organization sweeping powers that already it's questionable whether or not they're meeting some of their mandate. And they're going to have these sweeping powers to make all kinds of new regulations and have a huge arbitration process without really knowing what it's going to mean. And that's extremely concerning, especially for the small independent news media organizations.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to congratulate my colleague on her speech, and just wondering if she'd quickly answer a question about the arbitration process she just referenced. Is it possible for 9 members appointed by the Minister of the Government to be truly free and fair in their decision-making? I'd ask her opinion on that.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country, very short answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. Well, that is extremely concerning, and we've seen even in other appointments in many different ways with this government how you know, it's questionable really how nonpartisan and how independent some of those appointments are. So it's extremely concerning that you've given a minister, you've taken it out of a completely nonpartisan, sort of separate organization and put it right into the minister's office to make appointments, that is extremely concerning, and that's in fact what this legislation has done.